Now, where were we? Picking right on up where we left off, going into the next book. The next book is called White Flight, Atlanta and the Making of Modern Conservatism by Dr. Kevin Kruse, who is a professor of history at Princeton University. Now, this next book is important because it picks up from where we left off in 1945 with Black Metropolis, and it brings us smoothly into the Civil Rights era, which was a major pivotal point for America in general. Now, White Flight is a great book to segue into this era because it places us directly into the scene with a lot of firsthand accounts. And it does something that most books on this topic don't do, which is provide the perspectives of both the blacks and the whites, who in most instances stood for opposing causes. So we get a chance to see why both of them did what they did and acted the way they acted. Okay? Now, surprisingly, Atlanta was a city that projected itself as progressive for nearly 2 decades prior to the 1960s civil rights era. They presented to the world an image of blacks and whites coexisting in peace, getting along together, and progressing economically. So much so that William Hartsfield thought it necessary to coin the phrase Atlanta, the city too busy to hate. And apparently that was the case as long as Negroes remained in their place and played by the rules. Now, when Negroes did otherwise, then inconsistencies in that motto began to show up. For example, as we open up the book, Dr. Kruse in his introduction details an occasion that took place in Peyton Forest. And this is where some blacks were leaving the black area to move to the white Peyton Forest neighborhood. And whites resisted. Indeed, by the end of July 1963, all but 15 white families had sold their homes to black buyers and abandoned the neighborhood, which has been the typical response by whites when Negroes move too close. And it was a required response for many of them if they wanted to maintain their superiority story. It's hard to keep the narrative alive if people that they're supposed to be superior to live right next to them and have access to the same things. So a distance had to be created. One way they maintained that distance was to move out of the neighborhood when Negroes arrived. They were not simply fleeing Peyton Forest, Copeland pointed out, but the city itself.
We are trying to find some area outside the city limits where we can buy homes and get away from the problem
of desegregation, he noted.
Everybody I know is definitely leaving the city of Atlanta.
The problem in their mind was that they didn't want to live around Negroes. They genuinely did not want to do that. When you understand their mentality from their perspective, living next to Negroes was a major breach to the social code imagined by them. For a white to say that they lived in a black or colored neighborhood, that was perceived as a major downgrade and an unfortunate situation. So when blacks moved in, that very movement created an external pressure that interacted with the beliefs and values that made up the original white consciousness. And the pressure from that situation had a highly influential effect on their decision to leave. It didn't cause them to leave, but it had enough impact to make the decision to leave more appealing than staying. The Peyton Wall incident, as famous as it was fleeting, was only the most public eruption of the much larger phenomenon of white flight. That year alone, the beleaguered mayor noted, City Hall had been confronted with 52 separate cases of racial transition, incidents in which whites fled from neighborhoods as blacks bought homes there. So this was a widespread repeating pattern. And it's important to know that it wasn't just Atlanta that this happened in. It happened in every major city where this black and white dynamic occurred. And what this shows us is that we're dealing with a mental entity that emerged inside the physical vessel and is constructed uniformly based on similar beliefs, stories, and values that interact and intertwine in such a way to create this self-preserving entity, which reacts similarly across the board all around the United States. Because it's not as if all the whites got together in some football huddle and made some grand plan to move from the city into the suburbs once blacks arrived. That's not what happened. That same psychic organism emerged within each of them, and it influenced them to act in similar ways, regardless if they were in Los Angeles, Detroit, Chicago, or Atlanta. And although the information never appeared in Atlanta's positive press coverage, a steady stream of white flight had in fact been underway for nearly a decade. During the 5 years before the 1962 Peyton Forest Panic, for instance, nearly 30,000 whites had abandoned the city. They weren't playing games. We know that moving for most people is perceived as an inconvenience because it takes a lot of resources and a lot of planning, which means the reason for moving has to outweigh the comfort of staying. For many whites to leave the city, it shows us that blacks moving into the area was a strong enough reason for them to make a move. So this here was not a joke at all. They really believed in being separate from blacks at all costs. It was a top priority in their mental worldview. Afterward, the numbers only grew larger. In 1960, the total white population of Atlanta stood at barely more than 300,000. Over the course of that decade, roughly 60,000 whites fled from Atlanta. During the 1970s, another 100,000 would leave as well. The city too busy to hate, the skeptics noted, had become the city too busy moving to hate. It's getting good. While many have assumed that white flight was little more than a literal movement of the white population, this book argues that it represented a much more important transformation in the political ideology of those involved. Remember I told you about that mental organism? Well, it has a drive to survive. And in doing so, it can influence the person to adjust in order to protect it. That's the transformation of political ideology Dr. Kruse is talking about here. The whites would eventually change their language and their approach, and they would do it in such a way to conceal the white supremacy instead of plainly voicing it out as they had done previously. That was the adjustment made for that mental entity to keep itself alive. Because ideas, just like biological organisms, display this self-preserving tendency. Because of their confrontation with the civil rights movement, white Southern conservatives were forced to abandon their traditional, populist, and often starkly racist demagoguery and instead craft a new conservatism predicated on a language of rights, freedoms, and individualism. You hear that? Now, why did they have to abandon the old ways of being blunt and direct about their prejudice? Because the times had changed. If they would have continued voicing it in the old way, then they would have appeared to the rest of the world as people stuck in the past. So, to preserve their self-image and at the same time produce the same intended effect, they simply changed the way they spoke, which concealed the real intent. It's like a cover, a blanket. So on the surface, it was presented as rights, freedoms, and individualism, but beneath the surface, under the cover, it was preserving white over black hierarchy, keeping Negroes in their place, and maintaining the power structure. This modern conservatism proved to be both subtler and stronger than the politics that preceded it and helped Southern conservatives dominate the Republican Party, and through it, national politics as well. White flight in the end was more than a physical relocation. It was a political revolution. Come on with it. This study, however, argues that white resistance to desegregation was never as immobile or monolithic as its practitioners and chroniclers would have us believe. Indeed, segregationists could be incredibly innovative in the strategies and tactics they used to confront the civil rights movement. That's the adjustments and pivots they made, which was necessary because the civil rights movement gave a body to an opposing consciousness emerging within the human psyche. So, to deal with it, the white supremacy consciousness had to adjust, lest it be utterly wiped off the face of the earth. In recent work on the late 19th and early 20th century South, several historians have argued that the system of racial segregation was never a fixed entity, but rather a fluid relationship in which blacks and whites constantly adjusted to meet changing circumstances. If the Southern system of racial subjugation is understood as responsive to change during its era of dominance, it naturally follows that segregationist ideology and strategy did not remain inert when the system confronted, in the form of the civil rights movement, a threat to its very existence. That's what we just talked about. The ideologies didn't stay still, but instead they adjusted. We know that time keeps moving. So when forms, ideas, bodies, and anything else in the realm of existence interacts with time, they're always under some pressure to change. And those that can properly adjust under the pressure of change are those that survive the longest. What we see here with the white supremacy ideology is that adjustment to stay alive with the changing time. And, as this story makes clear, the original goals of massive resistance were, in fact, frequently revisited and revised as the struggle to defend the Southern way of life stretched on. What's the Southern way of life? It's those known as whites at the top and those identified as Negroes at the bottom. While national politicians waged a reactionary struggle in the courts and Congress to preserve the old system of de jure segregation, those at the local level were discovering a number of ways in which they could preserve and, indeed, perfect the realities of racial segregation outside the realm of law and politics. Ultimately, the mass migration of whites from cities to the suburbs proved to be the most successful segregationist response to the moral demands of the civil rights movement and the legal authority of the courts. Moving to the suburbs was one of the clean ways they discovered to create that distance. The distance needed to keep the supremacy alive. And clean it was. It was a clean move. Although the suburbs were just as segregated as the city, and truthfully, often more so, white residents succeeded in convincing the courts, the nation, and even themselves that this phenomenon represented de facto segregation, something that stemmed not from the race-conscious actions of residents, but instead from less offensive issues like class stratification and post-war sprawl. That was the cover-up. Remember, blunt and direct speech on this topic at that time was becoming a point of contention. So the idea was to clothe the intention by muddying the water with different language. So it made it harder for anyone to expose or to pull back the curtain and reveal the underlying motive. To be sure, on the surface, the world of white suburbia looked little like the world of white supremacy, but these worlds did have much in common, from the remarkably similar levels of racial, social, and political homogeneity to their shared ideologies that stressed individual rights over communal responsibilities, privatization over public welfare, and free enterprise above everything else. And blacks also picked up each of these ideas, and in many cases as strongly as whites did, especially the individual rights over communal responsibility. The blacks who became part of the economic middle and upper class, they took this on fully. So many of them took on the very same ideas that whites used to try to fence them in. By withdrawing to the suburbs and recreating its world there, the politics of massive resistance continued to thrive for decades after its supposed death. If we truly seek to understand segregationists, not to excuse or absolve them, but to understand them, then we must first understand how they understood themselves. Until now, because of the tendency to focus on the reactionary leaders of massive resistance, segregationists have largely been understood simply as the opposition to the civil rights movement. They have been framed as a group focused solely on suppressing the rights of others, whether that be the larger cause of civil rights or any number of individual entitlements, such as the rights of blacks to vote, assemble, speak, protest, or own property. Segregationists, of course, did stand against those things, and often with bloody and brutal consequences. But, like all people, they did not think of themselves in terms of what they opposed, but rather in terms of what they supported. The conventional wisdom has held that they were only fighting against the rights of others. But, in their own minds, segregationists were instead fighting for rights of their own, such as the right to select their neighbors, their employees, and their children's classmates, the right to do as they please with their private property and personal businesses, and, perhaps most important, the right to remain free from what they saw as dangerous encroachments by the federal government. Pay attention to this because it's the backbone of their argument presented throughout the book. Instead of just being plain about it and saying that they didn't want to live near blacks and have their kids go to school with them, they instead learned to lead with a language that emphasized the right to select their neighbors and the right to serve who they wanted to serve as customers, and so on and so forth. So the trick here is that both the explicit and the implicit were intended to create the same outcome, which was to keep Negroes at a distance. But the delivery about rights was way more palatable to the general public, because it's much more difficult to argue against rights of association than it is to argue against blunt prejudice. And that's why they eventually went that route. To be sure, all of these positive rights were grounded in a negative system of discrimination and racism, like we just said. In the minds of segregationists, however, such rights existed all the same. Indeed, from their perspective, it was clearly they who defended individual freedom, while the so-called civil rights activists aligned themselves with a powerful central state, demanded increased governmental regulation of local affairs, and waged a sustained assault on the individual economic, social, and political prerogatives of others. The true goal of desegregation, these white Southerners insisted, was not to end the system of racial oppression in the South, but to install a new system that oppressed them instead. Oh, snaps! And we will see in this book how the money-making white man teamed up with the black leadership to throw the middle and lower income whites under the bus. They recognized that much of the system had been turned on them, which is why they had to get creative in running to the suburbs and altering their political ideology. Understand, as this study demonstrates, Southern whites fundamentally understood their support of segregation as a defense of their own liberties rather than a denial of others. While this study sees more similarities than differences in the urban struggles of the North and South, it does find such differences. Unlike Northern studies, which uncovered large amounts of hidden violence sparked by residential conflicts and chronicled a successful white resistance to racial change, this study demonstrates, almost counterintuitively, that whites in this segregated city were generally less violent in their resistance and less successful than their counterparts in the urban North. The relative failure of racists in Atlanta was not due to their lack of commitment to the cause, but because the black population they challenged was both larger and stronger than those in the North. And the black population got busy during this era for sure. This is when blacks reached their peak in collective strategy and resistance against the supremacy entity. So that's going to show up a lot in this book because they did get busy. In terms of percentages, Atlanta's black population outpaced that of most northern cities. In 1940, for instance, blacks represented 35% of Atlanta's population, but just 8 and 9% in Chicago and Detroit, respectively. By the 1970s, as the disparities in racial percentages narrowed, these metropolitan areas looked more alike. with black political power rising in the cities and conservative white suburbs growing around them. So get ready for it, because this book is about to bridge a lot of gaps, and it's going to give both sides of the story. We're going to see whites throwing other whites under the bus. We'll see blacks forcing their way into white establishments. We'll see violence, resistance, strategy on both sides. And we'll essentially see a duel between multiple mental entities on the city and suburban battlefields. So stay tuned, because it's about to get wild. I thank you for your time and attention. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.